Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're taking a sledgehammer to a myth that gets repeated so often it's basically treated as undeniable common knowledge. We all have this image in our heads of our hunter-gatherer ancestors living in this brutal, constant cycle of feast and famine. You know the picture. Gaunt, desperate cavemen constantly teetering on the absolute edge of starvation, just praying for their next lucky strike? Well, get ready because the actual data reveals a completely different reality.
Okay, let's dive into this. You've probably heard this popular idea of early humans gorging on a mammoth and then literally starving for weeks until the next kill. It's so deeply embedded in modern thinking that it became the unquestioned foundation for major scientific theories. Theories that are used right now, today, to explain why so many people struggle with modern metabolic diseases like obesity and diabetes. We've always been told our bodies are just bracing for a famine that, for those of us in the modern world, is never actually going to come. But what if that ancestral famine never really existed the way we thought?
To uncover the truth, here is our roadmap for this explainer. We'll start by busting the starving caveman myth, then compare early farmers to foragers. Next, we'll unpack the incredibly clever ancient survival toolkit, explore our body's biological backup plans, and finally, we'll rethink the famous thrifty gene.
Part 1. The Starving Caveman Myth. It's a twist nobody saw coming.
So for decades, popular science assumed foraging populations were always just one missed hunt away from total disaster. But when researchers actually tested this against real data from a massive cross-cultural study of hunter-gatherer societies, the results were totally shocking. Looking at the numbers, hunter-gatherers actually experienced famines way less often, and when they did occur, they were significantly less severe. They did have temporary seasonal lean periods, sure, but those multi-year mass mortality famines, they were genuinely uncommon. Now, consider the early farmers. Serious, widespread famine was actually much more prevalent in those so-called advanced agricultural societies.
Which brings us to Part 2, Farmers versus Foragers, the agricultural irony.
Why does this constant starvation myth persist so stubbornly? Well, mostly because settling down to farm just looks like obvious linear progress to us. It feels counterintuitive to imagine that the lifestyle agriculture replaced was actually more secure. But this brilliantly illustrates the real irony of agricultural progress. Think about foragers for a second. Their lean periods were just seasonal dips or localized resource disruptions that the community could naturally manage. Now look at early farmers. By relying heavily on just one or two staple crops like wheat or rice, they traded flexibility for efficiency. It was incredibly brittle. I mean, a single drought could trigger a catastrophic crop failure, leading to multi-year mass starvation events. Hunter-gatherers simply didn't concentrate their risk in that incredibly fragile way.
Part 3, the ancient survival toolkit, 4 clever strategies for survival.
So if hunter-gatherers weren't constantly starving, what exactly were they doing to prevent food scarcity from becoming a life-threatening crisis? The answer isn't just one magic bullet, it's a remarkably sophisticated toolkit of 4 overlapping strategies: dietary breadth, mobility, social structure, and scavenging. And the genius part is that these strategies operated simultaneously. They covered for each other, meaning no single failure could threaten the entire group all at once. Let's break these down because they are incredibly clever.
First up is dietary breadth, or what researchers call broad-spectrum foraging. This wasn't just grabbing what happened to be nearby, it was a deliberate, diversified approach. Ancient humans were drawing calories simultaneously from meat, fish, nuts, tubers, fruit, the whole shebang. If the big game hunt failed for an entire week, it wasn't a crisis. There were still tubers in the ground and shellfish on the shore. Without even consciously designing it as such, this deliberately diversified diet acted as a powerful natural insurance policy against bad luck.
Strategy number 2 was mobility. Any guesses on what this number represents? 7 to 500 is the estimated square miles of land hunter-gatherer groups needed access to. It sounds absolutely massive, but this space was their greatest asset. It gave them the freedom to simply walk away from local droughts or depleted areas. Farmers, on the other hand, permanently traded this freedom away. They couldn't exactly pick up their irrigation systems and fields and move. When the rains didn't come, they were trapped. Foragers, they simply relocated.
The third strategy is arguably the most elegant: social structure, specifically risk pooling. We always picture every caveman fending for himself, right? But successful hunters distributed their kills widely across the group in these layered, predictable waves. It created a web of obligation and reciprocity. You share today, others share with you next week when your own luck runs dry. Mathematically, this system minimized the risk of individual starvation perfectly. It was a highly effective biological insurance system, culturally enforced long before written contracts or modern financial markets ever existed.
And the fourth pillar of the toolkit is scavenging. For a long time, scavenging was treated as this embarrassing, primitive phase in our evolution, like eating cold leftovers. But recent research completely reframes this. Scavenging was actually a smart, deliberate, and highly reliable strategy that required far less energy than chasing down live prey. And humans had unique advantages here. First off, our strong stomach acid neutralized pathogens in decomposing meat. Second, our incredible long-distance walking ability let us methodically locate abandoned carcasses before competing scavengers stripped them bare. And third, our use of fire and stone tools meant we could extract calorie-dense bone marrow and fat that other animals simply couldn't access. It wasn't a desperate last resort. It was a reliable card in the deck.
Part 4. Biological Backup Plans. The body's built-in survival sequence.
Let's move to and see how this builds. Because what happens when the local environment is truly barren and all those careful social safeguards and toolkits fail? Well, the human body doesn't just weaken and shut down randomly. It executes this beautifully structured, multi-stage metabolic shutdown designed by millions of years of evolution. In the first 24 to 48 hours, the body burns through glycogen stores in the liver and muscles, creating new glucose to keep the brain functioning. After about 4 to 5 days, a fundamental metabolic shift happens. Ketogenesis kicks in. The body switches to burning fat and ketones, which drastically reduces the breakdown in your precious muscle tissue. Thyroid hormone activity changes, and your overall metabolic rate drops to conserve energy. Eventually, the body settles into a remarkably stable state that can keep someone alive for over a month or much longer depending on their starting fat reserves.
Part 5. Rethinking the Thrifty Gene. A major scientific course correction. This built-in biological machinery is so impressive that it led to one of the most influential theories of the 20th century. Proposed back in the 1960s, the thrifty gene hypothesis suggests that specific genes evolved to promote incredibly efficient fat storage to help us survive frequent, brutal ancient famines. The theory goes that today, in our world of constant food abundance, those same unchecked genes are what cause the widespread obesity and diabetes epidemics. So, the crucial point is, for this widely accepted evolutionary theory to be true, it absolutely requires early humans to have suffered through frequent, severe, population-thinning famines to drive that natural selection. But as we just learned from the cross-cultural data, those famines were largely a myth.
Which leaves us with a fascinating mystery. If frequent, deadly starvation wasn't constantly culling early human populations, then what actually caused our genetic variation in body fat? If the thrifty gene loses its core requirement, researchers like Jonathan Speakman have proposed a very compelling alternative explanation.
The old assumption was that nature selected for fat storage through starvation, but consider the new predation alternative. Think about it. For millions of years, there was an evolutionary pressure keeping hominids relatively lean, and that was predation. If you carried too much body weight, you were simply too slow to outrun large carnivores. But, roughly 2 million years ago, humans invented fire, we developed handheld weapons, and utilized organized social defense. We effectively removed the active threat of being hunted. Without predators actively culling the heaviest individuals from the population, genetic variation in overall body fatness was simply set free to drift randomly. No famine-driven selective pressure is actually required at all to explain the body weight variations we see today.
It's an ongoing scientific debate, but it really just shows how an entire field of medical research can be built on a faulty assumption. So I want to leave you with this question. If the starving caveman was mostly a myth, how does that rewrite the story you've been told about your own modern biology? It's pretty amazing how a slight shift in our understanding of the past can completely alter how we see ourselves today. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning those entrenched assumptions, and I'll catch you next time.
Okay, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're exploring the fascinating, kind of hidden history of how ancient humans actually managed to survive and thrive. We're going to look at some ingenious strategies, totally surprising biology, and the critical alliances that kept our ancestors alive. Because you know that whole story you think you know about the starving caveman? Yeah, it's probably dead wrong. Just imagine this scenario for a second. You wake up tomorrow, and every single animal on Earth has vanished overnight. No cows, no horses, no dogs, not even a bee. Nothing. Just you, some plants, and a terrifying amount of silence. So how long would you last? Well, a lot of people think, oh, I just eat plants and figure it out, no big deal. But honestly, simply eating plants would not save you from a cold, hungry demise in the ancient world. I mean, you can't plow a field without an ox, you can't insulate yourself in the dead of winter with just a pile of leaves, and you can't even keep crops alive without insects pollinating them. For ancient humans, this wasn't some fun hypothetical. It was a looming daily reality. But before we even get to the animals, we have to completely dismantle this deeply embedded and, frankly, entirely false assumption. I'm talking about the idea that our hunter-gatherer ancestors lived in this brutal, never-ending cycle of feast and famine. You know the exact image I'm talking about, right? A gaunt caveman gorging on a mammoth and then literally starving for weeks. We treat it like it's a historical fact. But when researchers actually tested this against cross-cultural data regarding famine, well, the results completely flipped the script on what we thought we knew. Section 1. The Starving Caveman Myths. The data reveals this incredible irony. Early agricultural societies, which we almost always view as this massive leap forward in progress, were actually far more fragile and way more prone to starvation than the foragers they replaced. Now, did hunter-gatherers experience lean periods? Sure, absolutely, but they were highly localized. Multi-year, life-threatening famines were actually really uncommon for them. But compare that to early farmers. By settling down and betting everything on just one or two staple crops, they essentially concentrated all their risk. A single bad drought could trigger a catastrophic multi-year subsistence crisis that hunter-gatherers simply didn't have to face. So let's look at Section 2, the Ancient Survival Toolkit. So how exactly did they avoid starvation? Well, they relied on 4 overlapping strategies that worked together completely seamlessly. It basically guaranteed that if one single resource failed, the whole community wouldn't just collapse with it. First up, broad-spectrum foraging. This just meant eating a hugely diverse mix of meat, fish, nuts, and tubers. Basically, if the hunt failed, they had backups ready to go. Second is mobility. Hunter-gatherers needed massive territories. We're talking anywhere from 7 to 500 square miles. If a certain area dried up, they didn't just sit around and pray for rain. They literally packed up and walked away. Now, the third strategy is truly elegant. Sharing meat across layered networks functioned as this mathematically brilliant biological insurance policy. And this was thousands of years before modern finance or written contracts even existed. Think about it. If you had a great hunt today, you didn't just hoard the meat. You shared it outward, first to your immediate family, then to the wider group. And in return, you built this complex web of obligation. The unpredictability of the hunt was literally smoothed out across the entire community. A real game changer. And finally, the fourth strategy, scavenging. For decades, researchers totally wrote this off as some primitive, embarrassing phase of human history. But in reality, it was incredibly smart. Humans capitalized on having really strong stomach acid to handle decomposing meat, plus our ability to walk long distances to reach abandoned carcasses first. We also used tools and fire to extract that super calorie-dense bone marrow that other predators simply couldn't touch. So it wasn't some humiliating last resort at all. It was a highly reliable, deliberate, and integrated daily survival strategy. Moving on to Section 3, the biological backup plan. But look, environments are unpredictable, right? So what actually happened when all those careful social safeguards failed and food actually ran short? Well, it turns out your body has a brilliantly elegant biological backup plan. After a day or two of burning through your stored glycogen, you don't just shut down linearly. Actually, it takes about 4 to 5 days of total food deprivation for the human body to shift gears into a highly sustainable metabolic state of burning fat and ketones. Your metabolic rate drops, your precious muscle protein is fiercely protected, and your brain entirely switches its primary fuel source. Depending on how much body fat you started with, this carefully sequenced shutdown could stretch survival out for weeks, just waiting out the scarcity. And because these ancient famines were actually quite rare, it means the wildly popular thrifty gene hypothesis, the 1960s theory that blames modern obesity on famine-adapted genes, is actually on incredibly shaky ground. I mean, if our ancestors weren't constantly starving, they didn't strictly need to evolve to hoard fat. Instead, researchers now suggest these genes might have just drifted randomly once early humans mastered fire and weapons. That mastery effectively removed the evolutionary pressure to stay lean enough to outrun predators. Pretty mind-blowing, right? All right, Section 4, way more than meat. Now, let's talk about the human brain. It is an absolute calorie-destroying monster. It takes up 20% of your energy just sitting there while you're resting. Plant-based foraging alone, which is highly seasonal and lacks dense fats, simply could not support this kind of massive biological overhead. Building and maintaining human intelligence biologically required massive, and I mean massive, amounts of animal fat. Hunting wasn't just a fun lifestyle choice. It was the absolutely required fuel for human evolution itself. But they didn't just eat the meat and call it a day. When you really break it down, animals were essentially the fundamental technology and the physical infrastructure of ancient civilization. Look at this. Bone marrow was basically calorie-dense nature's butter. Hides insulated them against freezing winters. Animal stomachs were engineered into actual water pouches. Bones were turned into sophisticated tools and needles. And animal fat? They used it to fuel lamps, extending human productivity and social organization deep into the night. It was, quite literally, ancient electricity. Which brings us to Section 5, the Domestication Revolution. This incredibly deep dependency on animals triggered probably the most important strategic pivot in all of human history, starting around 10 to 15,000 years ago. Domestication happened in these staggered, revolutionary waves that fundamentally rewired the global economy, military strategy, and daily security. First, we had dogs, offering an incomparable nose that basically acted as a biological security camera. Then goats and sheep introduced a renewable milk economy, meaning food that didn't actually require killing the animal. And then around 4000 BCE came the ultimate game changer, the horse. To put the sheer power of the horse into perspective for a second, just look at the Persian Royal Road. It stretched an absolutely incredible 2,500 kilometers. That vast communication and trade network was only functionally possible because of the horse. It quite literally compressed distance. Before the horse, armies and information traveled at a walking pace. But with it, empires could project power and actually govern massive continent-spanning territories. But hey, let's not forget the unsung heroes here, the insects and birds that quietly held these empires together. Bees gave us wax to waterproof tools and tablets, plus honey, which is a natural antibiotic that literally never spoils. Silkworms single-handedly sparked the Silk Road, moving ideas and wealth across the globe. Carrier pigeons acted as the ancient telegraph system, absolutely crucial for military communication, even up to World War I. And oxen and donkeys, they were the heavy construction equipment of the ancient world that dragged the pyramids and early temples right into existence. And our final section, Section 6, our first great alliance. Because our survival was so entirely, inextricably tied to these creatures, the psychological impact on us was profound. Ancient humans didn't just use animals, they elevated them to gods. They wrapped this very rational, daily economic dependence in a layer of deep spiritual reverence. The Egyptians worshipped Anubis the jackal because they deeply respected the predators patrolling their boundaries. In Hinduism, protecting the sacred cow was essentially a brilliant policy to protect a living tractor and milk machine. The Norse mythologized Odin's ravens as a divine intelligence network. And for Native Americans, the buffalo was the absolute material and spiritual center of their entire universe. Now, look at how we live today. It is frankly embarrassingly recent in our roughly 300,000-year history that we've become totally disconnected from this daily life-or-death relationship with the animal kingdom. Today, our food comes wrapped in plastic, our light comes from a wire, and our clothes are mostly synthetic. But for almost all of human existence, rendering fat and reading animal behavior wasn't just fun trivia. It was the mandatory curriculum for staying alive on Earth. Every single time you're warm, fed, and have the luxury to think about literally anything other than sheer survival, you are standing on the shoulders of an ancient interspecies partnership. We simply didn't conquer this planet alone. So, as you go about enjoying the comforts of modern life, ask yourself, if all the animals vanished tomorrow, exactly how much of our advanced civilization would actually survive without the partners that built it in the first place?